Yeah, thank you all for sticking around for this next talk. So this is the topic that's actually at the front of my current research is wild mushrooms, what mushrooms actually exist here in Indiana. To tell you the truth, I haven't actually cultivated mushrooms in a number of years now. You know, after I wrote that book, that was kind of the capstone of my cultivation experience. And so most of my focus has really gone these days to understanding what exists in nature. You know, I want to understand all of the mushrooms, all of the macrofungi that currently exist in our state. So there's no region that's ever had a complete biological survey. No region in the entire continental, actually all of North America, that's ever had a really truly extensive survey of all the macrofungi that exist. I think I mentioned last time it's likely that at least half of the species that exist here in Indiana are still unknown to science. And so every time you go out in the woods, there's a chance of finding something entirely new. And that's one of the focuses of what we do with the Hoosier Mushroom Society. So we take people out into the woods and go collect the mushrooms that are out there, teach the most useful identifying characteristics, and really work as a group to identify them. They're, excuse me. We don't just focus on edible mushrooms as a part of the Hoosier Mushroom Society. That's what many people are interested in. But my focus is on really everything that's out there. And so during a foray, we'll definitely spend most of the time on the edibles because that's what most people are interested in. But a lot of people are also interested in everything else that's out there, whether or not it's edible, and what's the unique features of these individual things. But this talk today is mostly going to be about common edible mushrooms of Indiana that people tend to seek out in the woods. And so the most common edible mushroom is about to be appearing here within the next month or so. How many people are morel hunters or have morel hunted? So most of the room. That's the mushroom that's the most commonly sought after edible here in Indiana. And I would say that most people have a general awareness of in our state. So the earliest I've seen it, found morels in Indiana is about March 13th. Does anyone think they can beat that date? Has anyone found them sooner than March 13th in Indiana? So I would say, I ask that to most audiences that I give these types of talks to, and I haven't had anybody tell me they found them sooner than that date, so I think that's a very reasonable starting point. We have photographic evidence on that date. But that was also an anomalous year. If you think back to, I don't have that slide in this presentation. If you think back to 2012, I think it was, there was a period during March where about half of the month of March was getting up into the 70s and 80s. And so that really kicked the entire season forward. And so, when these things start appearing, when a morel mushroom begins to appear is completely influenced by the environmental conditions leading up to the time that they typically fruit. So, in 2012, they were starting really, really early relative to a normal year. If there was cold weather that extended throughout April, they would be delayed. They wouldn't fruit until, mid to late April in this part of the state. So the weather influence is a vital influence on where these things are actually, or when these things actually occur. If you hunt morels, something that most people don't know, or a lot of people don't know anyway, is where they actually start. And so around this time of the year, the map that you're looking at there is where the kind of the southern most areas where these things fruit. So they'll typically start, they've already started down in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi right now. They are fruiting down there. People are picking full-grown morels today. And so as the season progresses, we build these things sometimes called morel progression maps. And you can just kind of track the season as it goes north, through Indiana, through Michigan, through Minnesota, ultimately up to Alaska. Morels have been found in all 50 states. So they do actually occur everywhere. But they have this general progression that follows the temperature. The primary thing people are looking for with morels is the ground temperature. So if you look at some of the maps that farmers use of soil temperature, I think it's taken about 4 inches deep down in the soil. Once it reaches 50 degrees or less, that's a reasonable time to get out and to start finding them. And they're so popular in Indiana. One of the reasons is because they're a valuable commodity. Sometimes they can sell for $40 or $50 a pound. If you ever attended, there was the Mansfield Mushroom Festival is what it's called. You hear about morels selling there for $80, $100 a pound at auction. So these things can be quite valuable, but that's not the only reason why people are looking for them. It's also interesting because they're one of the first mushrooms to come up throughout the year. They're easily identifiable. And so people that are, have cabin fever throughout the winter, it's something really nice to do to go out in the spring and you get a pretty nice meal out of it. So there's a number of reasons why these things are popular. But there are many, many other mushrooms other than morels. I think I mentioned Indiana has about 3,000 to 4,000 species of mushrooms. And so let's put that into some context. Anyone know the total number of trees in Indiana? Some people think tree identification is hard. Someone throw out a ballpark. About 100, give or take, species of trees. And so if identifying trees is difficult and there's only 100 species of trees in the entire state, imagine trying to learn 3,000 or 4,000 different species. Put it into some more context. There's about 600-700 species of birds in all of North America. Some people find birding to be pretty difficult. Well, if you want to learn all of the birds in North America, you only have to learn about 700. If you want to learn all the mushrooms of Indiana, you have to learn about 3,000 to 4,000. And half of them are currently undescribed, so you can't even put a name to them. One other thing I would mention here just about wild mushrooms generally, only a small percentage of these things are deadly poisonous. I could count on one hand the number of common deadly poisonous species in Indiana out of this total number. So most mushrooms are not edible, but also not poisonous. What do I mean by that? So they're not edible because they're unpalatable. They might have a woody texture, a bad flavor, but they aren't going to be particularly harmful to your body. You could eat tree bark. Tree bark is edible, but it's not going to be palatable. So that's the area most mushrooms fall into. They're just not going to be edible, not because they're poisonous, but because they have some other type of characteristic that makes them unpalatable. And as I mentioned, there's very few that are deadly poisonous. On the left is an example of a mushroom that I would consider edible but not palatable. It's called an artist conch, and it just has a really woody texture. And so you're not going to be able to eat it. That's one you could actually make into a tea. I mentioned medicinal mushrooms in the last talk, so there are medicinal properties associated with this artist conch, and some people will slice them thin, make some tea out of it. The two species on the right are the two most common deadly poisonous species in Indiana. The top one's called, trying to think of the common name, a deadly Gallerina, and the bottom one is called a destroying angel. And so just by learning those two mushrooms, that's the majority of the deadly poisonous mushrooms that you're likely to encounter across the state just by learning those two. So there are others out there, obviously, but those two are the most common. So how many field guides are there for Indiana mushrooms? 0. For the Midwest, there's a few, but there's not very many. One of the best ones that's come out recently would be this mushrooms, what do they call it? Mushrooms of the Midwest by Michael Kuo and Andy Methvin. Michael Kuo's the guy that does mushroomexpert.com. If you've ever seen that website, it's probably one of the best resources for Midwestern mushrooms. But even for the Midwest, there's not very many. That's the first one I would suggest. The other one that I would suggest is mushrooms of West Virginia and the Central Appalachians. So that just kind of shows, if I'm suggesting that book as being relevant for Indiana, one of the best books for Indiana, that shows how much limited information there are that is out there in actually identifying these wild species. So that's very good for edible mushroom identification. There's only about, I'm talking if you're just trying to learn, what's out in the woods, what you're likely to expect. So that book has listed about maybe 20, 25 species or so of the most common edibles, and is very good for edible mushrooms. But really, stepping out of those 25 species, it has no information on, essentially. So how many mycologists are there in Indiana? So mycologists are people that study fungi. Well, there used to be about 5. The guy, that bottom star down in Bloomington, the last mycologist at IU just retired a couple years ago, and they aren't refilling the position with a mycologist. The star on the right over in Muncie, the professor there was trained as a mycologist, but he primarily works with plants now. So for an area as large as Indiana, there's really only 3 people, that care about this topic in any way. And so just by that, it tells you how understudied these things are. And why can identification be difficult? Well, if you just look at the white mushrooms of Indiana, there's easily over 100 species. I've never tried to do a formal count, but I can tell you it's probably going to be double or triple that, at least, of mushrooms that are just all white. And so the color of the mushroom, the point here is that the color is one of the last things you should look at for most species. The color is not going to help you identify it, except in a small number of edible species, which we'll talk about in a second. But color is going to be one of the last things to look at when you're working to identify mushrooms. So the reasons why mushrooms are so difficult to study is that most of the organism is underground or in the wood. When you're looking at a mushroom, all you're looking at is the reproductive structure. You're looking at the apple on the tree. The main body of the organism, the main thallus of the organism, is actually living underground or in the wood. So all you're looking at with the mushroom is just that reproductive structure. And so, I mentioned that because, especially with plants, people are often really concerned about harvesting plants in the woods and what's going to be the environmental impact. And that's perfectly reasonable for plants, but I'd make the claim that it's perfectly unreasonable for fungi. There have been a number of studies for various types of mushrooms, long-term studies lasting 20 and 30 years, where they have completely picked every mushroom every year over the course of the study site. And what those studies have shown is, if anything, the number of mushrooms being produced have slightly increased over that time. There's literally no correlation between harvesting mushrooms and environmental impact. The only environmental impact would be things like soil compaction. People going off the trail, trampling through the woods, the soil compacting is, that can be an issue, especially when, during Morels season, where you get rings around every elm tree, from people walking out in the woods looking for morels. So, I would say this is another area to think about mushrooms as slightly different than you might most other organismal groups. Harvesting mushrooms does not have a significant environmental impact on the mushrooms themselves, at least. Another reason they're so difficult to study is they're microscopic. So, it sounds weird to say because you can easily see most mushrooms, but the main body of the organism starts off as a spore and grows these little filamentous threads through the soil called hyphae. And that's the main body of the fungus. And it's microscopic. Those threads, those hyphal threads, are, they're considered to be microorganisms. It's the same category as bacteria. You need to look at them under a microscope to be able to study them. So, that's another reason why they're really difficult to study on an ongoing basis. Just like with cultivation, when you grow mushrooms, there's a very short life cycle on the fruits that you produce. Mushrooms in nature have a very short life cycle as well, in terms of how long they're actually above the surface and visible to people. So you have to, if for someone wanting to study mushrooms, you have to be at the right place at the right time, where this thing's fruiting, and have it be in good condition so you can actually, assess the features, the structural features of it to be able to understand what's there. Most of the time, you're going to miss out on that ideal opportunity. It might be about 2 weeks for most mushrooms, I would say, is the typical life cycle of when you actually can see a mushroom and have it be in a good condition to study. But just having that very short lifespan makes the overall study of them very difficult. Another thing is, even within a single species, I put significant morphological variation. What that means is that you could have two completely different looks to a mushroom, visually, including things like color or things like, the shape of the cap. The same species can actually look completely different from the time it's young to the time it's fully grown to the time it's old. There can be even 4 or 5 completely different looks during that whole span of the life cycle. And so that's another thing that really complicates identification efforts. Not only do you have to learn what, for these 3,000 or 4,000 species, what any individual species looks like, you have to understand the range of morphological variation of these things throughout time. And so, that doubles, triples the amount of information you need to actually understand these species. There's very few common names for mushrooms. One of the things I would like to do when I'm out with people on forays is to talk in common names to them. When I start saying Latin names, that just kind of makes people's eyes glaze over. But oftentimes I have no other option because there are no common names for most mushroom species. And so if you're really interested in learning wild mushrooms broadly, not just edibles, you have no choice but to start learning the scientific names for these species because there are no common names available. If you want to communicate what you're finding to other people, the only thing you can utilize is the scientific name. And obviously, large land areas unexplored, large numbers of species, but we don't know what we have. And that's the primary project that I've been working on right now. So my goal is to know all of the macrofungi that exist in Indiana. One of my key research interests is finding that answer by engaging citizen scientists. So if you think about the scale of the problem that's out there, how much we need to do to understand fungi, with the small number of mycologists that I showed you, you can't rely on professionals to be able to do these things. And so what I've really been working to do is engage average people that have an interest in being outdoors and working with fungi to help me with my project by making collections, by taking photographs, by sending me the specimens. We have DNA results on about 5,000 collections of Indiana mushrooms so far. And I would say I'm probably only halfway to getting even a reasonable understanding of what all exists here. I won't go into this too much, but so mushrooms themselves have very short life cycles. But by looking at the DNA in soils, you can see what mushrooms exist in the soil without having to have the fruiting body. And so that's another big component of what I do, is trying to get as many environmental samples. We call it eDNA. I could walk outside right now into the grass, take some of the soil, do a DNA extraction, and look at all the mushrooms that are likely to be growing in that grass at some point in the future. And so you could see how that might be helpful in trying to make a determination about what exists in our state, because that takes away the requirement that you have to be at that right place at the right time when that mushroom is fruiting. And so that's a pretty cool area. I'm trying to do as much of that as I can for our state. But that's really how I see getting us to the point to where we can actually understand what is likely to exist and where in our state. So I mentioned this with the previous talk. I also, in the past, was a mushroom cultivator. May get into it again in the future, but for now, I've been pretty busy with school. So one thing I would mention is wild mushrooms can be harvested year-round. Anyone know a particular species that can be found year-round? They can be found every month of the year. Oysters. I've found oyster mushrooms every month of the year within the state of Indiana, and so you can think about them as being universally available. But there aren't many other mushrooms that you can find year-round. There's a couple that are associated with cold weather primarily, or warmer weather, but there's very few that you can be found year-round other than oysters. So just because you can harvest mushrooms year-round, one of the things I wanted to go into this talk was what are the rules and regulations regarding harvesting wild mushrooms within Indiana? And I would say the current code leaves some ambiguity, both for potential buyers, sellers, and regulators. So if you're wanting to understand one of the first aspects of the law in Indiana, there's a general rule within Indiana state parks and other natural areas to not damage or collect a plant or pick flowers, but specifically exempted from this are mushrooms and other foraged goods. So if you wanted to go pick nuts and berries and leaves, greens, those types of things, they're specifically exempted from the regulations that you're specifically allowed to go use Indiana state properties to harvest mushrooms. But they have a really strange definition for what a mushroom is. The Indiana code says a mushroom means an edible fungus. And so that leaves a couple questions. I guess one initial one that jumps out at me is what does edible mean? So that seems like a fairly straightforward word, but I mentioned the Ganoderma, so the artist conch, a second ago that people might want to use for tea. If you have this woody fungus and you slice it up, use it as tea, is it edible? Yeah, I would say so. There's just a lot of other situations like that to where these mushrooms, if you're using it for medicinal purposes broadly, is that considered edible? There's a lot of poisonous mushrooms, such as a morel. It's going to sound weird me saying a morel is a poisonous mushroom, but it is until it's cooked. Has anyone tried eating raw morels? I bet it didn't go so well. So some people, if they eat raw morels, they can never even eat cooked morels again because they have an allergic reaction, they have really bad gastrointestinal distress. A morel is a poisonous mushroom until it's cooked. There's a lot of other poisonous mushrooms that, there's various ways to prepare them, such as parboiling them and, removing the water, or, a lot of different ways to prepare poisonous mushrooms to make them edible. And so that's where this, becomes just strangely ambiguous to me, is so, defining a mushroom as an edible fungus. That's about the worst of all worlds in terms of defining, what a mushroom is. If I had a definition, it would be the macroscopic fruiting body of a fungus. So, a fungus that produces a mushroom that you can see with your eyes. That's my definition of what a mushroom is. But, just putting in edible fungus, it's open to interpretation. I'm not even going to say it. I will. So people always say, there's an old saying, every mushroom is edible, but sometimes only once. It's like the most overused thing in the mushroom world. Please don't repeat it. Now I feel bad that I said it on stage. So some other mushrooms, let's see. Well, another section of the code that specifically pertains to wild mushrooms is about introducing mushrooms into the food supply. So the current regulations are that each mushroom that you want to introduce has to be individually inspected and found to be safe by a mushroom identification expert. But then back when this was written, it didn't define what a mushroom identification expert was, didn't define how to become a mushroom identification expert. There were no qualifications on, who could do this and who couldn't. And so that's something we've been actually working to change over the last number of years. So the origins of the Indiana rules, the origins of that exact verbiage in that regulation came from something called the Conference for Food Protection back in the 1980s. It's associated with the FDA, and they produced a set of guidance documents. The last one was updated in 2014, which I'll talk about in a second. But that's what a whole lot of states followed in terms of developing their guidance for actually putting wild mushrooms into the food supply. A whole bunch of states have that same language, and a whole bunch of states have that same problem. They don't define what a mushroom certification expert is, a mushroom identification expert. So about 5 years ago now, we had been working with the State Department of Health to actually come up with a plan to allow people to get certified in wild mushrooms. And so the Department of Health, one of the reasons why we started this process was the Conference for Food Protection has been meeting again recently and updating their guidance document to have a wild mushroom certification plan. And I'm actually on the committee to help develop that plan. But that's why we started this process, is because they were about to release new regulations, and we wanted to have input on it and have Indiana kind of be at the forefront of having the changes that are being requested already in place by the time it gets pushed to the public. So we had worked with the State Department of Health and as well as Purdue Extension to develop this wild mushroom course. This year there's only going to be one of them on April 6th in West Lafayette, Indiana. So coming up in about a month, you can get information if you're interested in that at HoosierMushrooms.org, which is our Mushroom Society website. The general goals of the course, for me, it has kind of two goals. From a personal level, I want to teach people about mushrooms as much as possible. That's why I do a lot of what I do, is I really like interacting with people and trying to spread the knowledge about fungi as much as possible. That's one of the things that I care about the most. But there is a greater goal to this, and that's to help develop a safe market for wild mushrooms to develop in Indiana. So I mentioned the Conference for Food Protection was re-meeting, and they have an updated guidance document, and some of the things that are going to be pushed out to the states is essentially setting standards for what mushrooms can be sold within the states, how record keeping and traceability, traceback needs to occur, and it helps to establish the qualifications or training programs for wild mushroom identification experts. So some of the criteria that are used in selecting what wild mushrooms will be included or currently are included for Indiana are whether or not they're already in commerce. It doesn't make much sense to train people on mushrooms that are never even going to be utilized in the food supply. It's just like a waste of human capital at that point. They need to be easily identified with field characteristics, common, generally can be low allergenic risk, so not toxic to most people. approved for sale in other states as well. It just helps set kind of a basis for what species of mushrooms should be included in these certification courses. And so another aspect is establishing a committee of all of these types of people, regulatory agencies, poison control centers, mycological organizations, colleges, wild mushroom foragers. This is what we did about 5 years ago now. We had this committee in Indianapolis. We all sat down in a room and kind of got everybody's take and inputs on what they wanted to see as a result of the planning process. And kind of what we came out with included a list of species that are approved for sale in Indiana. You'll probably recognize a number of the names on there. Morels are number 1, and Americana should not be capitalized. But chicken of the woods, hen of the woods, lion's mane, puffballs, chanterelles, and black trumpets. So let me go through, I'll talk about morels for a little bit because the season's coming up and a lot of you are probably ready to get out there and find them. We do have a number of morel species in Indiana. The taxonomy of these, so that our understanding of what they should be called, has been changing a lot in recent years. Morchella americana is the current name for our Midwestern blonde, so our yellow morels. That's the scientific name for those. For the black morels, we actually have 2 species in Indiana. Morchella angusticeps is going to be the most common one. Morchella diminutiva, should be an A there, is if you've ever found little small yellow morels growing under tulip poplars, under tulip trees, those are an entirely different species than the rest of the yellows. And Morchella punctipes, and so those are the half-free morels, which have some of their own defining features. But we probably have 5 or 6 species in Indiana. We probably have 1 other species of black morel that's not listed here. And it's possible we have a 2nd species of yellow. So 5 or 6 species of morels in Indiana is probably the best number we can estimate at this point. So one of the things that most people want to know is where can you actually find these things? And I listed here woods, hillside, valleys, lowlands, uplands, yards, creeks, really anywhere. Anywhere there's organic material, you have the possibility of finding morels. So there's going to be some places where you're going to be much more likely to find them and other places where you're going to be less likely to find them. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. So over on the right, you see orchards, railroad tracks around Mayapples with old orchards are typically, I've never actually hunted one, but I've heard from any number of people that they're quite good. But you need to go to like an old apple orchard that's like 100 years old or something like that to find them. And apparently they grow like weeds sometimes. Railroad tracks, for whatever reason, they tend to like to grow around railroad tracks, but one of the problems with that is they often spray chemicals around railroad tracks, and so it might not be best to eat mushrooms that you find along roadsides or along railroad tracks, just because of the environmental contamination. Around Mayapples is an old wives' tale that I don't think there's actually any true correlation there, but a lot of people say look under Mayapples, and you find morels under Mayapples a few times, and you're going to keep on looking under Mayapples. But I don't think there's any actual association there. I think it's just one of those things that a numbers game. And also out west, so they find them in different locations than they do here. Even up in Michigan, if there's a big deep burn, there's going to be lots of morels that occur after that deep burn. We haven't had large-scale, deep wildfires in Indiana for quite a while, as far as I'm aware of. They had one in Michigan a few years back, and it produced a whole lot of burn morels. Our prescribed burns in our state forests aren't deep enough to initiate those species. So it's actually a distinct species of morel that comes up after a burn. And I've hunted the prescribed burn areas of the state parks, and you're just unlikely you're not going to find that species from a prescribed burn as far as I've ever seen. They also have landscape morels out west. And so these are they're wood decomposing morels. And so the most common place you find them is on landscaping that people put in the previous year. And so morels have a lot of different habitats depending on where you go in the country. Where you can hunt in Indiana, state parks, state forests, state nature preserves, as long as they are on within the borders of a state park is what that should read. So, there's nature preserves that are kind of standalone nature preserves outside of the state park, and those you don't have permission to go hunt on, the nature preserves. But if the nature preserve is within the boundaries of a state park, you do have permission to hunt mushrooms there. One thing I would mention is on state land, you aren't supposed to sell the mushrooms that you find from state land. But we also have state recreational areas, some national forests. Mushroom hunting is allowed in Hoosier National Forest. It's not allowed at the Dunes National Lakeshore, which is now Dunes State National Park, I believe, which is interesting. Some land trusts allow hunters. As an example, down in Bloomington, they have, now I'm blanking on the name, Sycamore Land Trust does not allow hunters. Up by Lafayette, we have Niches Land Trust. They do allow mushroom hunting on their properties. And so those areas have a whole lot of properties typically. I think Niches has like 30 or some different properties located in that region. And so by looking at the websites and contacting the owners of those individual land trusts, they may or may not allow you to have permission. We list a number of the land trusts where we have information on the Hoosier Mushroom Society website. But that's, if you're always looking for more places to hunt, that might be a good place to scope out. And also private property with permission. Private property is generally going to be the best place to go and find morels. Because if you go to a state park or a state forest, there's going to be a lot of people that have covered that before you. And so the chances that someone else has come onto that private property is going to be far lower than if you're hunting on public land. So I would say typically private land is going to be best. But you go where you can, and you'll definitely have success if you spend enough time in our state forests. Generally with morels, it's a numbers game. So what do I mean by that is going where you have the best odds of finding them and putting yourself in the right position to be able to find them. So what's the best place for them? Well, it's going to be around very specific types of trees. So if you are in an oak-dominant woods, you're going to have very little chance of finding morels. So the number one thing I could suggest if you want to improve your odds of finding morels is becoming a good tree identifier. The better you are at identifying trees, the better you're going to be at finding morel mushrooms. So the best mushroom hunters I know, morel hunters I know, what they do is, stand back and look at it, find the next tree they want to go to, walk over to that tree and just kind of squat down next to it and look around it. So if it's on this list, one of those target trees, that's what they would do. If they don't see mushrooms around this tree, they're looking for the next tree on this list and then going to that tree. They're just not randomly looking at the ground as they walk through the woods. The best odds of finding the most morels are always going to be around this small group of trees on this list, I would say. Another odd qualifier is elm trees. You're not looking for living elm trees. You're looking for dying or dead, recently dead elm trees. So after an elm tree dies, that's when you hear about people having the mother lode of morels coming in, that's almost universally going to be around a dying or dead elm tree. I've never seen, those are always the biggest harvests that I've ever seen are from those dead or dying elms. All of those other types of trees, you can definitely find them. Ash trees, you want living ash. Tulip poplar, I've seen big harvests around dead tulip trees before. So, that might be one or the other. The weird thing about sycamore and tulip trees are some years are going to be really good for those trees, some years are going to be really bad. And I'm not able to correlate. Does anyone have an idea about why? Does anyone believe that to be true and have an idea on why that might be? Because I honestly don't know. I've never tried to correlate the season, the individual characteristics of a season with good fruiting for either of those. But some years will be sycamore years or tulip tree years, and some years won't. I don't know why. Yeah?
When you mentioned elm, are you talking about American elm?
Both. Yep. So I've seen huge harvests under both. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, for virtually all mushroom species, more rain is going to mean more mushrooms. So if there's a really dry season, it's really going to suppress the harvest. If there's a really wet season, it's really going to help it out. And so the amount of moisture that comes in the preceding period plays as much of a role as the temperature does in the preceding period. So there are other trees that aren't on this list, like hop hornbeam or, those actually dead or dying ones. I found some pretty harvest under that, and various other tree species. But these are the main ones, I would say, to check out if you're interested in finding morels. So the main reason why most people don't find morels is they're just kind of randomly looking around an oak forest, and you're just not going to find any. Until you understand your tree identification, to be able to put yourself in the right position to be able to find them, you're just not going to have much luck. There are a number of lookalikes that occur to morels in Indiana. Each of those mushrooms in that photograph is a different species of mushroom. So the first one I'll talk about is a verpa. These are not very common within Indiana. If you go up to Michigan, they're going to be far more common. Some people talk about them as being a perfectly edible mushroom. I would tend to, and this is what gets into, people are going to have endless debates on this type of thing, whether or not a verpa is poisonous. I would tend to think they aren't for most people. And so that's another thing about edibility of mushrooms that, that definition being used by Indiana doesn't really account for. What percentage of people need to have a negative reaction for it to be considered not edible? These probably 60-40, 70-30 or something like that. 70% won't have a reaction to them. And so that's going to be true for a number of different species of mushrooms. Everyone's own biology, physiology is different and can handle different inputs differently. And so not every mushroom is built the same for most people. Another good example of that is going to be chicken of the woods. That has a much higher percentage of people having some type of negative reaction than for any of the other edibles on this list. But generally, verpas aren't very common in Indiana. The farther north you go, the more common they get. You can find them throughout the state, though. The main difference between a morel is if you... gotta go way back. Morels, if you look at the lower right, they kind of have what's referred to as pits and ridges on the upper part of the cap surface. So it's like really well-defined ridges with pits going down through it. A verpa, on the other hand, is going to be more brain-like. Just folds, kind of smoother folds going across it, or just perfectly smooth. Some species of verpa are just smooth on the cap. The other thing is that the cap is only going to be attached to the very top. What I mean by that, it's going to be like a thimble. If this is the stem, the attachment is only going to be right here. If you look at a morel, it's going to be attached broadly down the entire upper surface of the cap. So those are some of just the characteristics that if you're interested in learning more about mushrooms, that you would need to start understanding to be able to start delineating these species in these groups. Another example of a verpa, if you look at this particular picture, verpas also have a cottony material on the inside of the stem. Morels are completely hollow on the inside. So that's just another interesting feature. How much time do I have? Okay. So here's an example of showing several things, actually. The picture on the top right is the verpa. You can see what I was talking about with that thimble cap with the stem only attached to the very top. All of these are mushrooms that are sliced in half. You also, on that upper right picture, you see the cottony material on the inside of the stem. The one on the left is a true morel. You see it's kind of hollow all the way down through it, and there's a smooth transition to the stem. The lower right is what's called a half-free morel, and you can probably guess why it gets that name. The cap is half free from the stem. So it's like an intermediary between a true morel and a verpa. And so there's just some examples on how to identify these species. For morels, cutting them in half is going to be one of the easiest ways to make a determination whether it's a true morel or a false morel. Another group that's somewhat common in Indiana, typically before the morels come out, are called beefsteaks or false morels. Gyromitra is the scientific name for it. These, if you were to cut it in half, they're more or less going to be solid on the interior. And so for almost all of the morel lookalikes, just cutting them in half gives you all of the information you need to be able to distinguish a true morel from a false morel. Any other questions about morels before we move on? Yeah.
I've heard that they do well in bright sunlight and do well in shade. Is there any...
Both. So, well, yeah, I don't really see a strong correlation between bright light or shade in terms of the volume or they're going to dry out faster if they're not shaded, as an example, or they might get sunburnt faster, so discolored on the surface. They tend to produce more melanin in the sunlight, so the sunlight triggers melanin production, which gives them a darker pigment in the light. Sometimes if you find like unpigmented morels, you pick up a leaf, they've been growing in the shade the whole time, they aren't going to have very much pigment to them. They're almost going to look gray. But then you take them, leave them out in the sun or something like that, they'll develop that color. So yeah, I don't see much correlation in terms of like fruiting. Any other morel questions? We will continue on. So another common edible Indiana mushroom. This is probably one of the second most commonly sought out mushrooms, and there's a market for these all across the state. People sell these at most farmers markets, I would say now. It's called a chicken of the woods. I initially said that color is not an important identifying characteristic. This is the mushroom that I was talking about where it is an important identifying characteristic, both on the upper surface as well as the undersurface. So the upper side is going to be more or less completely orange, or it's going to have yellow along the margin where it's still actively growing. Once it's done actively growing, the entire upper surface is going to be orange. Then if you were to flip that one over, it's going to have a sulfur yellow underside, so that really bright yellow undersurface. That's why it gets the name Laetoporus letiporus sulphureus. So we have two different species of chickens of the woods in Indiana. We have one that grows directly from wood, which is on the upper left. That's going to have the bright yellow underside. We have another one, Cincinnatus, that grows at the base of trees and has a white poor underside. So we do have two species of chicken of the woods in Indiana. Hen of the woods we talked about in the cultivation segment. I guess I would mention that I've grown the mycelium of this. I know there's a mushroom cultivators in the room. The mycelium for this is really cool because it's like orange and cottony. So, most mycelium that you see in the bags is white. This one's actually the color of the mushroom, more or less, and it's really, really orange and cottony. But I've never tried to actually fruit this, and so that would be an interesting thing for somebody to try to do, and get some pictures of it fruiting. That would be interesting. Hen of the woods is another commonly cultivated species. It's also common in nature. It's primarily found in the fall, in late October, for most of the state. But a lot of people would say this is one of the best edible mushrooms. It's right at the top of their list, higher than morels in terms of edibility. And in certain Indiana woods, you might be able to get, go to Brown County State Park at the right type of year with all the oaks. You could probably pull a pickup truck bed full of these things out of the woods over the course of a day. Lion's mane is also a commonly cultivated mushroom, and it's also a really good wild edible in Indiana. This particular species isn't as commonly found. We do have at least three species of lion's mane in Indiana. This one, you find it maybe once a year if you're out in the woods regularly, twice a year maybe. So it's just not very common. You can't expect to go out in the woods on any given day and fill up a whole bag full of these, but it's nice to find whenever you do. It's a really beautiful mushroom. If you were to cut it open on the inside, it's like a central mass that's not solid, almost a texture of like lobster or something. But then it has these white little icicles that come down and droop down all over the exterior of the fruiting body. So it's a really nice mushroom visually to find, but it also tastes really good. It kind of has the texture of lobster as well when you cook it. It'll kind of pick up the flavor of whatever you cook it with. Cauliflower mushrooms. We have two species in Indiana. And once again, they aren't the most common species that you're likely to encounter, but you do find them if you spend enough time in the woods. Giant puffballs, calvaceous. These commonly grow in lawns. You can find them in the woods as well. They often grow in large fairy rings. Sometimes if you find the right place, you can just follow a trace of these large giant puffballs, in a giant ring in the woods. And so that's usually fun to find. I wouldn't say these are among the best edibles. Most people find them to be pretty bland. But they can grow. The largest report of these is about 3 meters wide. That's huge. Most commonly, they're going to be about the size of a basketball to a volleyball, I would say, when they're fully grown. But that's still a reasonable size. Chanterelles, next to morels, are probably the most sought out mushroom in Indiana. This is a group that we've been working on recently. We have at least 16 species of chanterelles in Indiana. So the numbers are going to keep on climbing, I think. The most common one is the one pictured. This is called a smooth chanterelle. And chanterelles are kind of distinguished by having false gills at the bottom, so they don't have true sharp blade-like gills like a lot of mushrooms do. These just have kind of little ridges on the underside where gills would be. And they also have kind of an apricot odor. They're relatively easy to distinguish in the woods. There's really only one major lookalike to them, that if you learn how to tell the difference between true gills and false gills, you can't make that mistake. So that would be the kind of thing that we would teach in the certification course, for chanterelles is, comparing all of the key features to tell a true chanterelle from any of the poisonous lookalikes. I would say the poisonous lookalike for this is also the most common cause of mushroom poisoning in the state of Indiana. Anyone know the name of the mushroom I'm talking about? A jack-o'-lantern. That's the most commonly confused mushroom, probably because people are seeking chanterelles out. They see this big orange clump of mushrooms at the base of a tree. I've heard of people feeding it to like a dinner of a dozen people. It's going to cause severe gastrointestinal distress is the polite way to put it. So, learning some of those key differences on how to tell a true chanterelle from the false ones is going to be vital if you plan on seeking out these mushrooms. Another close relative to chanterelles are black trumpets. There are very few mushrooms that are better after they're dried and then rehydrated. I would say this is going to be one of them. Rehydrated black trumpets they're quite good. And so if you've never found these, I definitely suggest trying to find them. They're really very easy to identify. There are no poisonous lookalikes. There are a couple other lookalikes to them. Oysters, among the most common mushrooms within the state of Indiana. We mentioned that you can find them year-round, essentially. So I won't spend too much time there. We have probably 4 or 5 species of oysters in Indiana. So it's not just one species that you're looking at. There's about 5 different species of mushrooms in Indiana. Sometimes the substrate that they're growing on is important, as well as other features. So the criteria that we mentioned earlier on, in terms of setting up the identification program, to select wild mushrooms are that they were already in commerce, easily identified, common, generally considered to be a low allergenic risk. Out of everything we just talked about, the only one that I would say is the most likely to cause an allergy is chicken of the woods, and that's only in rare cases. But these are the kind of the features that we use when selecting those previous sets of mushrooms in order to have certified for sale in Indiana. Just a couple other things I'll mention in terms of the certification program itself. One of the things we discuss is record keeping and traceability. For the buyers, I believe they are going to need to maintain the records for 90 days. And if you're a mushroom seller, it would essentially be certifying them on a form similar to this. I'm selling X amount of pounds of this particular species harvested in this county, and they were identified by your name. And so that's kind of a typical form for selling to the market. We do have 2 different courses throughout the year, Morels and Food Safety, and that's going to occur April 6th is the next one. It's typically 3 to 4 hours. We've held them all over the state in the past. This year they're going to be, it's going to be in West Lafayette. And we also do a wild mushroom course in the summer. So the first course only covers all the Morel species in our state, as well as has a food safety component. Which is one of the requirements of setting up these courses. But then our wild mushroom course, it doesn't have the food safety component, and it covers most of the species that we just briefly went over in much greater detail. The wild mushroom course is typically 5 to 6 hours long. You would get a booklet beforehand, to study up on. There is a graded exam at the end. And so, you have to kind of prepare for this course. It's not just come and sit through it and be done. So that's something to consider as you're thinking about it. Yeah. There's not. It's going to probably be in June or July is when we, probably July is when we typically hold it. There's no longer a 3-year period on Morels. So once you have it, you have it. Which is also going to make the economics of us hosting the course, not quite as good. We've been seeing a consistent decline, because everybody's certified now, First year we would have hundreds of people coming, and this year we can only hold 1 course. So it might be, if you're interested, it's probably going to be a good year to do it, because I just don't know if it's going to be sustainable longer term. No recertification for that either. Yep.
Okay.
So some other critical learning objectives that we go through in the course are, how to recognize mushroom poisoning, best practices for harvesting, best handling practices, and various other regulatory requirements that you might come into. So looking at possible foodborne illnesses associated with them, looking at the anatomy of mushrooms and how to accurately identify them, as well as all the poisonous lookalikes, as well as understanding more about the phenology of these things, where and when they occur, the habitats they occur in, the seasonality, et cetera. And finally, best handling practices is going to be something that we go into for each of the mushroom species. I would say these best handling practices are mostly covered in the food safety component of the course that's along with the Morels. And finally, regulatory requirements. So I have a few minutes left for mushrooms, or for questions. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and thank you all for coming. Yep.
You mentioned earlier that the scientific names for the morel mushrooms is mainly something that's true for all mushrooms, but you found that what was previously a Latin name, you can find other species that are Latin name, or you're separating them?
All of the above. So I would say the most common, I'm sorry? Yeah. So she was asking why the names are changing. So the Latin names, there's new Latin names for Morels, and why is that the case? Well, the Latin name that we used to have for Morels was a European species. And our North American species is different genetically and morphologically than the European species. And so just by the rules of botanical nomenclature, you can't have one name for two separate species. And so our North American thing needs a new name. And so that's one of the most common reasons. When people first started coming to America and studying fungi, they just applied the European names that the European explorers knew to our North American species. And that's just caused a lot of confusion because in most cases they aren't the same species. Another reason is, so there's two species of morels for like the Morchella americana, which is the common yellow morel. What we also found is there's a cryptic species there that can only be distinguished by DNA. So what visually as one species is actually two genetically. There's no way for us to tell them apart visually at this time. There might be an environmental trait. They might occur more likely with a certain tree, or they might, there might be something that we find in the future to be able to distinguish them in the field, but there's currently no way to do that. So that one was called Morchella cryptica, and then now it's called Morchella omeria. So even within, that's a whole another topic about why that name change occurred. But it's called Morchella omeria right now, and that's the cryptic morel, the cryptic yellow morel. We have DNA sequences for over 120 probably specimens of morels of yellow morels in Indiana. We've never found that species here, but it's known from every other state. So I don't know. No. Any other questions? Okay.
The map that you had with the gold spectrum stars, who are the mycologists in Northern Indiana?
So there's a guy named Scott Bates. He's at Purdue Northwest. And then there's a guy named Pete Avis, who's at IU Northwest. I work with Dr. Kathy Aim at Purdue. Then the guy who was trained in fungi at Ball State is Don Ruck, so he does a lot with the Indiana Academy of Sciences. And then the guy that just retired is Mike Tansey at IU. Any other questions? So yeah, thanks for coming, guys.